Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, thank you, everyone. This is our CHERA seminar, and then thank you for joining us today. We have two distinguished speakers today. Our first presenter will be Dr. Joonghyun Kwak. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford. And then we also have second speaker, Professor Maia Chankseliani. I hope my pronunciation was okay. She's one of the leading scholars in comparative education, international education from the University of Oxford. And thank you so much for joining. I'm happy to see some familiar faces and our students from comparative education and also higher education. Two speakers will present their research project for 40 minutes, 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will have a 20-minute discussion, Q&A. Joonghyun, over to you.
Thank you so much. So first I will share my screen. Okay, so first, thank you for inviting us to this wonderful CHERA seminar series. And a special thanks to Professor Jisun Jung for inviting us in this seminar. So my name is Joonghyun Kwak, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. And I'm joined by Professor Maia Chankseliani, an associate professor at Oxford and the PI of the International Mobility and World Development Project. As part of this broader project, today we will share our research on the link between international student mobility and poverty reduction. So I will start by giving a brief background of our project and present the findings from our quantitative analysis. Then Maia will continue with the research from our qualitative study and talk about the broader implication of our research. We really welcome your comments and questions because they will be especially helpful as we continue developing the qualitative part of this project. So let's get started. So in 2015, the United Nations launched the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, to create a better future for everyone. The first goal is to end poverty, and the first target of this goal is to eliminate extreme poverty. So poverty is broadly defined as the deprivation of the capabilities that restrict individuals' freedoms and opportunities. Income is important, but education also plays a key role by helping people gain skills, knowledge, and values needed to succeed in society. Because of this, improving education and making it more accessible are widely seen as essential steps toward reducing poverty. Interestingly, one target in the Sustainable Development Goal for education is to support international student mobility from developing countries through scholarships. This means studying abroad is viewed as a way to help developing countries grow. However, we still don't know enough about how students who return home after studying abroad might help reduce poverty. Our research aims to fill the gap using both numbers and personal stories. The connection between education and poverty reduction can be explained in two main ways, through economic and political perspectives. From an economic perspective, education expansion results in better labor productivity, which leads to economic growth. Then, this growth can reduce poverty by creating jobs, raising wages, improving health, and something like driving urban development. From a political view, education helps people take part in politics, including how leaders make decisions about resource allocation and public spending. So this kind of political engagement can push for fair laws and systems that reduce poverty. So in this context, we believe international students who return home can help reduce poverty in these ways. To explore how studying abroad can lead to broader changes in society, we constructed a theoretical framework for social change. We used ideas from transformative learning theory, critical realism, and transnationalism. First, transformative learning theory tells us that being in a new environment can change the way people see the world. So when international students live and study in different cultures of their host countries, they are exposed to new ideas and ways of thinking. These experiences can shift their perspectives and help them develop new solutions to challenges in their home countries. Critical realism helps us understand how agency and structures affect each other. So when students return home, they engage with existing social and institutional structures. Through this interaction, they can either drive change or help maintain stability depending on the context. Transnationalism goes beyond physical movement. So it looks at how people exchange knowledge and culture across borders. These exchanges can help returnees bring back skills, knowledge, and ideas that support development in their home countries. Therefore, transnational experiences and networks can help student returnees drive real social change, not just reinforce what already exists. Based on this background, we asked two research questions. First, we asked whether there is a link between international student mobility and poverty reduction in students' low and middle income home countries. So we use quantitative data and statistical methods to explore this broader trend. Second, how do personal experiences of studying abroad lead to contributions at the national or system level? So we use qualitative interviews to understand the pathways through which returnees may help reduce poverty. Let me now share the findings from our quantitative analysis. So we created cross-national time series dataset covering the years from 1999 to 2018 using publicly available sources. So we focused on 43 low-income and middle-income countries as defined by the World Bank in 1999. So these countries are shown in blue on this map. Unfortunately, almost all American countries were excluded because of missing data during this time period. So however, we did a separate simple analysis of African countries, so I will show it later. Our main outcome variable is extreme poverty, so defined as living on less than $2.15 per day. So since this data is skewed, we use the log transformation in the analysis. Our key independent variable is international student mobility, actually measured by the percentage of degree-seeking students studying abroad relative to the size of tertiary age population in their home countries. So to better reflect the influence of returnees, we use the lagged version of this variable. We also added various control variables to account for other possible explanations for poverty reduction. To examine the connection between international student returnees and poverty, we use dynamic panel regression models with the system generalized methods of moments GMM estimation. So this panel model includes a lag-dependent variable to capture any omitted historical effects that might influence the current level of poverty. Also, it addresses endogenous issues by using the explanatory variables as internal instruments. So this equation shows our model. So we include a 1-year lag of the dependent variable, poverty, and the OSM, outbound student mobility measure, represent the number of students studying abroad each year. So we set the initial lag at 5 years because students usually need at least that 5 years to complete their degrees and return home. We also tested longer legs, 10 and 15 years, to account for the time it may take for returnees to influence broader social and economic changes in their home countries. All other control variables are also lagged by 1 year to reduce the risk of simultaneity bias. Let's start. So this is the result. So here is a graph showing trends in outbound student mobility and poverty in 43 countries from 1999 to 2018. The solid line shows the average level of outbound student mobility, while the dotted line represents the average poverty rate. In 1999, only 0.7% of tertiary age students study abroad. By 2018, this rose to 3%. At the same time, extreme poverty dropped from 17.5% to 2%. So these trends suggest that higher international student mobility may be linked with lower poverty rates in their home countries. Now let's look at the regression result. So in the first model, we used a 5-year lag of outbound student mobility. The relationship between student mobility and poverty was negative, but it is not statistically significant. In the second model, with a 10-year lag, the relationship was slightly stronger, but still not significant. In the third model, using a 15-year lag, the relationship became significant and negative. The coefficient of negative 0.8186 suggests that a 1 percentage point increase in outbound student mobility is linked to a 17% drop in poverty. So this shows that students educated abroad may help reduce poverty in the long term. So since African countries were not part of the main model, we did a simple analysis for them. So this scatter plot shows the average poverty and student mobility for 46 African countries from 1999 to 2018. So this country level correlation is negative 0.677, indicating a strong negative relationship between student mobility and poverty. So although this is a simple analysis that does not account for changes over time, but it still supports the idea that international student mobility may contribute to poverty reduction. So in conclusion, we found that the immediate association between international student mobility on reducing extreme poverty is not significant, but its long-term association over a 15-year period is significant. So these results suggest that the transformative potential of international higher education for sustainable development, emphasizing its systemic and long-term effects in poverty alleviation. So this research has been published in the International Journal of Education Research. So if you want more detailed information, please read and review this article. So now I will hand over to Maia, who will present the qualitative findings and discuss the broader implications of our study.
Thank you so much, Joonghyun. Let me share my slides. Excellent. So you have just seen the big picture. Over 15 years, as Joonghyun explained, our study shows there is a measurable association between international mobility and reduced poverty in returnees' home countries. But the numbers, as we all know, do not tell us everything. So that's where we go to narratives, we go to qualitative data. Because to understand how the change actually happens, to move from trend lines to lived experience, we need to ask different kinds of questions. And we ask those questions in semi-structured interviews, which were part of this large project that Joonghyun already explained. And from this project, we extracted 143 interviews where returnees reported contributing broadly to economy and specifically to poverty reduction. So these 143 interviews constitute the basis of the findings that I will be sharing with you today. And these 143 interviews come from returnees in 57 different countries. Okay, these returnees, all of them obviously came back to their countries and contributed in different ways to public life, to policy, education, to entrepreneurship, and so on and so forth. These were semi-structured conversations, so they were long enough to trace not only what they accomplished, but also how they thought through their accomplishments and contributions. So what do returnees say about their role in public systems, in their communities, in contributing to fragile institutions? What do they feel they have built, and how do they feel they have tried to adapt and to make efforts to shift things, to make smaller contributions or sometimes much bigger contributions that they felt they have made to their society. So now let's zoom into their stories. So we have tried to analyze this data thematically, and we have established 4 different mechanisms through which returnees made those contributions. We are now also looking more in depth into the data and try to look at the pathways of change. So first of all, most of my talk will be focused on the mechanisms, these 4 mechanisms that we have identified and analyzed the data with this framework. And then I will also tell you a little bit about pathways, and I'll be really keen to hear what you think about using these 2 different approaches to data. On the one hand, looking at mechanisms, and on the other hand, looking at the actual pathways of change. So let me focus on the mechanisms first. The first mechanism, we call it agency and reflexivity, describes the capacity of returnees, the capacity that returnees develop to act strategically, especially when simple solutions do not work. Many of the returnees we spoke with reported that studying abroad helped them see challenges in their home countries differently and to navigate those challenges more strategically. For example, an Indonesian social entrepreneur studied impact measurement and social science at Imperial College London. She told us that international study gave her the ability to step back, to analyze complexity, and reassess her strategy of how to deal with this complexity. The habit of questioning assumptions, of asking whether a model is still doing what it's meant to do, became essential for her. So after returning, she led a social enterprise supporting low-income urban families through microfinance. After some time, she realized that income gains alone that she saw people would generate were not enough. Most families remained low income and were at constant risk of falling back into poverty. She realized she needed to rethink this model, so she redesigned it, pairing financial services with educational support for recipient families' children to improve their long-term prospects and to move families beyond subsistence. Reflecting on her international education, she said, education gives you that ability, critical thinking, analysis, framework, structure, right? But at the end of the day, you need to apply that into the real world. In other words, reflexivity that we have observed in our participants was not just abstract, it was lived. It's the moment they realized the model, the framework, the approach did not work, when they redesigned it and trying to stick to their big projects and stick to their true missions that they felt they had. Another example would be from Palestine. An entrepreneur returned from her master's degree in the UK and launched a digital jobs platform that employed around 700 people, mostly women and youth at the time of the interview in September 2023. She said it gives you a new way of thinking about her international education, new way of thinking not about me, but about how to build something for others. So this is agency. So agency is all about how people start thinking about things beyond themselves. They start thinking about changing structures and cultures around them. And almost all of our 704 interviews across the entire project reported the development of agency in one way or another. So this interviewee's business model was designed to adapt constantly, to work around curfews, internet outrages, closed banks. This was not just entrepreneurship, it was strategy under constraint, constantly dealing with structural constraints that she had to face. Both returnees here show us that agency is not just about bold leadership, it's about thoughtful adaptation and constant reflection. It's what allowed them to not only act, but to act meaningfully when the systems around them were not necessarily ready. So this was the first mechanism, very briefly. Now the second mechanism, we call it knowledge. And this second mechanism explains how returnees absorb different ideas, knowledges, approaches, skills that they then later translate into what is needed, adapt to local needs. What matters is not just a simple import of that content or knowledge or skill, but the ability to make knowledge work in a very different context that returnees face when they return back home. Here I have two examples, one from Bangladesh and another from Peru. So in Bangladesh, we have a researcher who completed a doctorate in political sociology at the University of Manchester in the UK that experienced, he said, reshaped entirely how he understood poverty. Not just as a question of income or aid, but as something rooted in institutional structures, political power, and long-term vulnerability. He said, our research initiated a focus on extreme poverty. In the late 1980s in Bangladesh, you would not see any reference to it. So he returned in the 80s to Bangladesh. Now it's central to policy. He told us that his doctoral training helped him see poverty not as a static condition, but as a dynamic and layered process. That shift allowed him to translate academic knowledge into new categories when he came back home, categories like extreme poverty, tomorrow's poor, poverty pockets, which reshaped national policies in Bangladesh and influenced major actors like BRAC and the government. So here, new knowledge is about reframing the terms of debate, developing locally relevant metrics, and influencing how resources were targeted on the ground. Okay, now if we move to Peru, a returnee there trained in urban economics and policy at Oxford Brookes and Cambridge told us, we learned many topics about urban economics, climate change, financing, urban development, and public policies, which definitely contributed to building this knowledge that I was later able to put into practice. So this returnee later co-authored Peru's national housing law, drawing on UK models, but redesigning them to reflect Peru's informal land markets and decentralized governance structures. She combined these global financing concepts that she learned about with participatory methods, ensuring the law could survive political transitions and reach underserved communities. So in both cases, international study expanded not only their technical knowledge, but also the ability to frame problems differently and to adapt to local realities and to propose credible, grounded alternatives, okay? So let's move to the third mechanism now, and another very important mechanism in our study, very powerful across interviews, is transnational social relations. So this is not only developing new international contacts, but also activating and adapting those ties to the work that returnees were doing back at home to address disadvantage and poverty related issues back at home. Here I'll bring two examples because I think examples really help to understand these things. One is from India and another from El Salvador. So in India, we had a Fulbright scholar and public policy leader who explained how his graduate studies in the US, obviously, reshaped his policy networks. As he put it, Fulbright allowed me to have a certain network, people who occupied leadership roles within institutions influential in the policy space. What he did is that he helped shape a nationwide reform of rural women collectives back in India, over 100 million members strong, that enables savings, access to credit, government entitlements, and job opportunities. He did this by strategically activating a network built through his Fulbright and Harvard experiences, kind of slightly different networks, but he mentioned this too. When initiatives stalled in government or donor spaces, he said he would quickly scan his network for allies, former classmates, Fulbrighters, or development professionals who he connected with through his mobility experiences, who could help unlock access, broker conversations, or facilitate co-financing of some of the initiatives he was leading on. These were not just symbolic connections, they were operational, and many of them he met during his graduate study. He reported were instrumental in achieving what he achieved in India. Now in El Salvador, another example, a returnee who studied sustainable development at Brandeis University in the US reported how his time abroad transformed his access to influence. Okay, we lifted that layer of social inhibition and we begin to know ourselves as individuals, that access had a direct and tangible effect on a joint venture of a company or social initiative. He credits these relationships he developed in the US with helping him launch a tech firm serving low-income and marginalized communities in El Salvador. Several initial clients came through contacts forged in the US. Relationships based on trust, built through shared work and values, as he reported. Okay, so this is the third mechanism, and now the final fourth mechanism, and really one of the most interesting for me personally is the development of civic understanding. Okay. So this final mechanism focuses on how international mobility can influence returnees' sense of responsibility towards their society, especially towards people in their society who are on the margins. Mobility helps reframe public service not as charity, but as systemic work rooted in accountability and inclusion. I have several examples here, really nice examples, but perhaps I should focus on one of them considering the time, or maybe two. Let me focus on two. So let's do Colombia first. A civic reformer who studied development management at LSC led a reform of social benefits delivery in Colombia. By linking multiple data sources, her team more precisely mapped low-income families and adjusted how programs were distributed. She said, "We managed to reduce poverty in Colombia by a little more than 2 percentage points through the targeting of state social programs with big data." She explained that at LSE, she focused on institutions, checks and balances, and the use of data for public accountability. That lens, she said, stayed with her when she returned and shaped how she approached fairness, inclusion, and evidence-based service delivery. I will now move to Peru, where we talked with a former prime minister, tax chief, and ombudswoman who described her studies at Harvard and the LSE again as formative, not just academically, but primarily from the civic perspective. At LSE, she learned to question systems and to probe assumptions. Harvard taught her to pursue truth as a public responsibility, she said. Together, these experiences formed her civic consciousness. But she said it was her time as ombudswoman. I think, if I'm not mistaken, she was the first ombudswoman, ombudsperson in Peru. She said that her time as ombudswoman, walking the most neglected corners of Peru, that became her real education in poverty. She said, I always say that was my doctorate, my PhD in poverty. She described the work with a powerful image. So she said, I was one of those people with my feet in one car and my hands holding onto the other so that it, the last car in the train, would not fall any further behind than it already was. So she felt the country was like a train speeding ahead for some, but leaving the last carriage behind. Her job, she said, was to stretch across both cars and stop the final one from disconnecting altogether. Her sense of civic duty was shaped by the contrast between the institutional standards she encountered abroad and the abandonment she saw at home. And it was that contrast, she said, that made her fight harder, speak louder, and, as she put it, hold the line. In these cases, civic understanding took form of not of a rhetoric, but of institutional redesign. And in the end, it was student mobility enabled, as explained by returnees, an expanded view of what citizens and governments owe to those who are most at risk of being left behind. So these four mechanisms that I talked about, agency and reflexivity, knowledge, transnational ties, and civic understanding. So having analyzed the data and having seen these four mechanisms, we feel that there is a space to also look at the data from a different perspective, from a slightly deeper perspective of looking at pathways. Now, mechanisms on their own, what has it, ties, knowledge, civic understanding, etc., they do not act on their own. So if mechanisms explain how mobility can generate some of these things like knowledge or civic understanding or transnational ties, pathways might show how returnees actually navigate complexity, constraint, and power relations to make these contributions real. They are not clean or sequential pathways. They may be quite messy and adaptive, but pathways we think are also important. So some of the pathways that we see in the data, and I have put on the slide, are there. We have not finished analyzing these pathways, but some returnees embed ideas directly into public institutions. So that could be the pathway of institutional infusion, and you heard some of those examples already. Others reimagine how services work, and that could be service redesign. Some returnees use the education to reframe the problem, as in knowledge adaptation, directly linked to knowledge mechanism. Others rely on trusted relationships to unlock funding or legitimacy related to network mobilization. And some act as strategic bridges, connecting sectors or actors that would not otherwise collaborate. So mechanisms might be another way, another analytical way to talk about explanations of how change happens. So now let's look on one of the final slides, and I'll finish soon, to see the barriers and constraints that get in the way of returnees, okay? So let's be honest that returnees do not just step off the plane and start transforming institutions. Almost all returnees we spoke with encountered significant issues related to structural, political, or cultural pushback. For example, in Colombia, one of the examples I have given to you already, a public sector reformer led a data-driven reform of welfare targeting, as I mentioned, but even with strong technical backing, reform ran up against systemic limits. She said a large part of the national budget comes from the previous year, and that's difficult. She also faced entrenched political influence over program allocation. She said the political issue in the allocation of resources plays a fundamental role in making any decisions. In Nepal, an innovator spent 2 decades working in rural education and health before founding the National Innovation Center that studied different social issues and economic issues using social science research. This person said, we do not have the culture of doing research and innovation in my country, so it was very difficult to set up this research center. So he lobbied for government support for 5 years, quite unsuccessfully, what ultimately enabled him to establish the center and to survive was citizen crowdfunding, not institutional readiness. Several returnees hinted at the same subtle tension, being perceived as too international or somewhat foreign, and their knowledge not being welcomed. Themselves being sometimes mistrusted, and their ideas required proof on local terms. So yes, these returnees brought knowledge, connections, and perspectives, but their impact often depended not just on what they knew, but on whether they could build trust, adapt strategies, and persist when institutions resisted change. And that is where we return to agency, not as independence from constraints, structural and cultural constraints, but the ability to move through these constraints, to listen, to recalibrate, to stay in the room long enough to shift what seems to be immovable at the first sight. So, what have we really seen here? This is my last slide. International study does not produce ready-made reformers. What it offers is something quieter but more powerful. It changes how people think, how they act in complexity, and how they keep going when systems and institutions push back. These returnees were not applying solutions. There were no examples, well, when they brought a new model or new framework and they just implemented it and it was successful, okay? They were building relationships, reframing problems, and co-creating new approaches and systems. Not one of them said the work that they did was easy, okay? But they stayed with their projects, with their ambitions, because they believed those things mattered. And today, when we see what's happening in the world, when international mobility is becoming definitely more politicized, more restricted in many recipient countries, and even more distrusted in many countries, we have to ask, what are we risking if we turn inward? Because if we stop enabling these cross-border movements, we may not just limit individual opportunities or individual futures. We may miss the opportunity to back a whole generation of people who can be future change makers, those who know how to move between worlds and make that movement count in their society. I will stop here. I would like to just show you this QR code to our project website, where we have just a few emerging publications because we just finished We're just finishing the project, but we will continue producing publications in the months and years to come. So please do follow our website, and we will be uploading all future output there. Thank you very much. Sorry, I took slightly more time than I intended, and we can now open to questions. Thank you.
No. Well, thank you so much, Maya. I see some questions are already coming up. First part of questions are all related with the first part of presentation in the quantitative analysis. So maybe Joonghyun can address some questions from the chat in terms of quantitative analysis. In the meantime, can I also receive some questions from the audience? Lily, you want to go first, and then we go back to the questions in the chat about quantitative part. Lily?
Thank you, Jisun, and thank you for the wonderful presentation. It's good to see you, Joonghyun and Maia. I really enjoyed the presentation, particularly this challenge, the long-standing argument about how international mobility has been related with elitism, that students from upper middle class background are those who are actually having international mobility in higher education. I have two questions. One is related to what extent, because this has been a strong argument that elitism is associated with international mobility. In contrast, that your data and both and reduce poverty. I wonder, have you seen the background? Have you looked into the background of these international students in terms of what kind of backgrounds they come from, and to what extent they are sort of from the more resourceful background and who are promoting changes in their home countries, or they are actually from more humble backgrounds and are bringing changes in a different way? And my second question is related to international higher education in particular. The four mechanisms are super interesting, but in another perspective is that these are all functions that we would expect higher education could, in general, could take. So in this way, do you think it's a failure or somewhat failure of the national higher education system, but then that is complemented by international mobility, or you think there are special aspects of international higher education that are sort of complementing what national higher education cannot do? Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Maya, you want to go first?
Thank you. Yes, two very difficult questions. Thank you, Lily. Okay, where to start? So social background is a very important question, okay? So when we started this project, which is the entire project is about returnees' contributions, as you know, not only to poverty, but to other domains as well. So two key big counter arguments that we were aware of, and those two counter arguments were constantly in our mind and we were constantly discussing. One of them was the inequalities in access to these opportunities, as you mentioned, Lily, and another big argument is about brain drain, that some of these people may never come back home, okay? So brain drain argument, somehow we tried to, in some of the modeling, trying to account for it by controlling for migration, social access to opportunities. Now, in our data that we currently have, we tried to code the background, okay? Tried to use quantitative coding. However, I do not think that was very easy to do. It's quite tricky to establish a socioeconomic background. So in most interviews, it is kind of, you can assess and estimate the background, but we did not specifically ask questions about the occupations of people's parents or incomes. And sometimes occupations, because the coding we used is the occupational classification, right? Sociological coding, but it's not always straightforward to use that when you do not have full data. And I do not think that that classification is bulletproof in all contexts. For example, if you look at post-Soviet countries, where I come from, Georgia, so occupation of your parents not necessarily determine whether you are elite or not, or education of your parents, etc. You see, so it's multiple things that you would need: occupation, you would need education, as well as income to really establish what is the background of the person. So while we have that data and we could actually dig into interviews and see more, I do not think we can say something conclusively at the moment. But what is very clear, especially in Africa, one of the researchers who is not here at the moment, Gardiana, who was in charge of the African interviews, she constantly tells us, and her conclusion is that in Africa, what she has seen is that definitely more privileged people had access to these opportunities, specifically to the East Education and Cultural Affairs Unit scholarships, American scholarships, because some of those are by nomination, for example, professional mobility scholarships, etc. So she felt that people who were more prominent, who were better networked, would have more opportunities. But I cannot say that about everyone across this sample, because we simply do not have conclusive evidence on that, you see. But this is a very big question, and we can look into it in greater detail. You see, so second one is about domestic higher education versus international. So some of the key things where we see differences is, first of all, transnational connections and transnational embeddedness. So domestic higher education, however internationalized it might be, even if it is UK higher education or the US, can never expose people to the full extent of transnational networks as one would be embedded into when they are abroad. Second thing is different epistemic traditions of knowledge, different types of knowledges that people are exposed to when they are abroad, not only within universities, but also outside. And that could be also framed as transnational, different transnational traditions and embeddedness in knowledge traditions. And very important one, which was not one of my mechanisms here, because simply I could not see much evidence of that in relation to poverty, but I see a lot of evidence on that in relation to other outcomes, which is intercultural understanding. And we have probably, if you look at the literature on international mobility, probably intercultural understanding is one of the biggest topic in papers, right? And we see a lot on intercultural understanding, on adaptability, on flexibility, empathy, and ethno-relative perspective. Those are our 4 codes in intercultural, okay? And that understanding that people develop, adaptability, flexibility, empathy to other, and ethno-relative perspectives, are immensely powerful for outcomes in terms of democratization outcomes and civic consciousness outcomes when we look at that, or related outcomes related to gender or education and health contributions. But somehow in the data, I could not see much related to intercultural when in the sample that talked about poverty contributions. So there was much more powerful stuff about knowledge, transnational links, civic understanding, and agency than intercultural. That's why it's not reported here, but intercultural was otherwise quite powerful. So I think it's intercultural, transnational, and different epistemic traditions that differentiate international higher education from domestic. And if I would summarize in one word, that would be encountering and engaging with the other, and being embedded in that environment where you are constantly encountering the other as other cultures, traditions, knowledges, languages, and so on and so forth. Sorry, I will stop.
Thank you, Maya and Lily. Joonghyun, you have a lot of questions about the analysis.
Sorry, Joonghyun, go ahead.
No, let me, what I do now, you can answer some questions, and then I will invite some people who post the question if they are not satisfied with your answer. So is that okay? Joonghyun, go ahead.
Yes, I looked through the questions in the chat box, and I think that the big question is about the return rate, or how we can know this, how many students actually stay in their home countries. Actually, that is I think the biggest limitation of the data, because we analyze macro level data, so we should just use the data from UNESCO and some other World Bank or like this. So we don't have information of the return rate. We know that people actually went outside of the countries for studying, but we don't know how many people, what percentage of students actually return to the countries, their home countries. So that is the limitation. So actually we included one proxy variable for return rate. So that is emigration rate of their home countries. We don't know specific segment of the population, but that is one proxy, just a weak proxy. But anyway, we include the emigration rate of the home countries. We actually try to control for the kind of return rate information within the model. So that is just limitation. We try to figure out how we can deal with that issues. And also one question about we can do some, I think, the simulation analysis. I think that is very good point. So first we can make the 5% return or 10%, 15% like this, using that kind of the manipulated data set, and then we can do some simulation analysis. That might be a very good research topics for the future research, I think. And also another question I understand I capture is about the variable, right? So GDP per capita, or like those variables sometimes are not significant. And also I didn't include Gini coefficient or unemployment rate or like this. Yes, there are a lot of candidate of control variables. We tried all these variables, and then the model strategy actually we can include only limited control variables for this model. So actually we just selected the important variables like GDP and education, and also all these variables, inequality and unemployment and economic development, HDI, or like this, are all very highly correlated. So I think we selected some of the variables and include the model. And also one of the reasons why the education and economic growth usually provide in the model does not present a strong significant effect. I think that is also one reason. That is also because of the kind of a high correlation between those variables or like this. So even if they have strong single impact or simple impact, but actually we control for other very similar types of variables, and then the impact might reduce. So that is, I think, the reason why we cannot see the other variable significance in the model. Also, because of the model strategy, we only focus on the immigration, or is it student mobility. So actually, we just use those variables as a control. And what else? I don't know. So what is the other questions?
Yeah, we can leave for now. I think there were some 4 questions about quantitative analysis from myself, Julio, Ugo, and Amelia. If one of you who posted a question about analysis, if you want to add up something, would you like to say something, Julio, Ugo, Amelia? All right, then can we move on? Our next question is from Chuchi. Chuchi, would you like to say, ask, or you want me to read the questions? Chuchi Su? Okay, maybe she's not available, so I can read it, the question. In the past, a foreign degree was regarded as a major career advantage. But now, in Chinese case, despite the overall economic recession, some Chinese employers prefer graduates with local educational background to the course and cultural fit and even geographical biases. Do you think this transformation has to some extent affected the power of international student mobility in poverty reduction?
I think the person is asking if the fact that more people are staying at home now affected. I do not know. So just one thing to say is that in our sample, we also have people who have not studied abroad, okay? Who have made similar contributions. It's only, I think, around 33 people from 704, 33 or 32 or 34, I do not remember exactly, but something very small number. In terms of poverty as such, there was not much to report there from what I remember from the comparison group. And I decided to focus largely on the mobile individuals, but that comparison group would allow us, when we dig more deeply into the analysis, comparative qualitative analysis, to compare the impacts of domestic higher education and international mobility. So basically, our study did not try to measure what these people achieved because it was a purposive sample of people. We just tried to select people who, where we had evidence that they have done they have contributed to some progressive change in their society, and then interviewed them and tried to find out what their educational experiences were. And many of them in our sample, as you can see, have just domestic education, and they have achieved similar things. So through our interviews, we try to just understand how educational experiences impact their formation, whether domestic or international. In many interviews, people who have international education have already also domestic educational experience, because many of them went abroad for master's or doctoral degrees, but had undergraduate education at home. And undergraduate education does develop very powerful networks, obviously. So those networks can be extremely impactful, especially in some country contexts, like, for example, China, to bring about positive change in the society. Because you need to be well networked, you need to know people, and those things can be really helpful. So if fewer people are going abroad, if that's the question here from China, whether that would have impact on poverty reduction in the future, we will need to just see whether it will be fewer people and it will have impact. Unfortunately, I cannot really say that now. And Chinese example, before we move on, is quite interesting, because we need to look not only at the numbers of people who go abroad, but the proportions of people who go abroad. And if we look at China, we will see that although the numbers are very high, proportionally, sorry, I cannot remember now at the top of my head, proportionally, it's a very small outbound mobility ratio, unlike many other countries. So proportionally, these people, the returnees, constitute a very small proportion of people who are with higher education.
Thank you, Maia. Next question is from Sheng Gao. Would you like to speak?
Hi. Yeah. Thank you for your sharing. From my knowledge, as we know, the economic benefits to the receiving countries, the most developed countries, are more apparent. The students, they can bring tuition fees, housing rents, consumption to the receiving countries. However, for the sending countries, they are normally low and middle income countries. So the poverty, also based on the cultural capital theory, the students who study abroad, they may have a richer family background. And of course, when they return their home, they have, no matter whether they have studied abroad, they have a stronger network or more richer family assets than other normal students. So how can we say that the correlationship between study abroad and poverty reduction is apparent or not. Thank you.
Do you want to take this?
Oh, yes. So in order to examine that part, actually we need some individual level data or some information. But actually in quantitative part, actually we just look at the trend between the student mobility and poverty reduction. So we cannot deal with those some inequality issues or like this. So I think one way is to deal with them part is to conduct some panel surveys from before the departure and after arrival, and we can trace their trajectories and how they work and gain during the outbound student mobility experience or after return. But that we don't have the kind of data, so that is, I think, we cannot deal with or analyze those part. But maybe qualitative part can have some information about the before the student mobility, what they got, and also after the student mobility, what they have changed or like this. But in quantitative part, we cannot deal with those problems.
All right, we have 6 more questions and time is running. So I will receive 3 questions at once, and then maybe speakers freely can answer to any questions. Can I invite Bruce? Bruce, are you there? Would you like to ask questions?
Yes, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, yes.
All right, so thank you for all the brilliant sharing and presentation. So my question to you is about the direct link between mobilities and poverty reduction. So my question is, beyond these individual success stories, how does the international students' mobility structurally address systematic poverty? Are there any measurable outcomes connecting returnee contributions to reduce poverty rates? And that will be my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And Svetlana, can I invite you to ask for next question?
Yes, thank you very much. Partly my question is related to the quantitative data. For example, I'm curious to know, do you have graphs or data of distribution of your respondents between the areas of studies? For example, how much of them were focused their study abroad in social sciences and STEM, and etc. And also in their country, what were the countries of study? It might be a question for your further publications. Because it would be extremely interesting to see. And as to related to qualitative data, I joined to Lily questions about elites. In some countries, especially, for example, in post-Soviet countries, when privileges are based not only on the material ground, but on the belonging to the privileged strata who control access abroad or prevent it. In these countries, the internationalization by itself and study abroad by itself, it's a privilege. Also a separate privilege generated by another privileges as well. And when the graduates from abroad, they return to this country, for example, to Russia, they use their knowledge to strengthen their privileges of their own, their universities, and their class. So they increase their agency, increase poverty, and increase their social polarization. What would you say about these cases?
Thank
you.
Thank you. I will take one more question from Ran. Ran, are you there? Okay, I will read the question for you. When conducting the interview, were there any particular patterns or themes that emerged across different regions and cultural contexts beside the four main mechanisms? Okay, so I take three questions first, and then two of you can address any questions, and then I can move on to the next package of the questions. All right.
So I will.
Thank you. Do you want to start, Joonghyun? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the great questions. Actually, this is very important part, and with all those questions were fantastic. So actually, really, we mentioned in the paper actually as a limitation of the research about those questions. First, areas of study and the host country context. Actually, in this research, we have not dealt with those issues. So in the future research, if we have good data, all of the problem is the data. So because of their limitation, we cannot actually analyze or examine this the different impact based on the areas of studies, and also those, if we have those data, we will do that in the future. And also host country context, yes. So this research is just simple research. So we just focus on the outbound student mobility rate. But we can deal with those, what is that, the host country context. So for the future research, it is our future research. We should look at if the host country's poverty rate is low or there's some political mechanisms are different, how those host country contexts affect the returnees transformation and how their those mechanisms impact their activities in the home countries. We can actually study those topics for the future, I think. Yeah, and I think another question is for Maya.
Thank you so much. So absolutely, we do have the data of on all our returnees on which subject they studied and which another question you had, discipline and something else. So all of that, yes, absolutely, I agree. So in future presentations, it will be very useful, I suppose, for the audience if I include a little slide at the start just to describe the sample. So that would be quite nice. Thank you for that. Of course, Svetlana, I fully agree with you that many returnees might come back and contribute and perpetuate to the stabilize and deepen the inequalities and political structures and so on and so forth in their home countries because they come from those social circles and they can perpetuate those. Quite interestingly, I know this conversation is recorded, but that's fine. I can still talk based on where I work. So I was recently talking with colleagues in Georgia, colleagues who are academics but also work in civil society, and we were talking how Georgia was a great example of transformative power of people who had international mobility experience in the mid-2000s, okay? Because the government then was constituted largely, the bulk of the government was constituted by people who had international mobility experiences. Some of them were from relatively more elite and privileged background, and others were from quite humble backgrounds who had got opportunities to study abroad purely because there were scholarships available. And those people made major breakthroughs to the democratization of the country. However, if you look at Georgia now, what is happening there when Georgia's path is going backwards from the progressive and liberal perspective, you would see that again in the amongst top decision makers, there are huge proportions of people who have studied abroad, had doctorates in Europe and America and so on and so forth. However, they are doing totally opposite in terms of progressive liberal normative approach, because everything is very normative in what we talk about now. We should acknowledge that. So of course there is an alternative story, and there will be a lot of empirical evidence across the world of totally opposite thing happening. So about all of these things, so this third thing that you mentioned can be added up to two things I mentioned at the start. So one is brain drain, second is inequality in access to these opportunities, and third, very closely linked with inequality, is that people may perpetuate, especially people from elites may perpetuate the political and social systems when they come back instead of changing them. And
Because
these three, I
they
think,
receive the
absolutely.
tools.
Yes,
The tools
absolutely. They
abroad.
receive the tools, discursive powers, different knowledges, because these different knowledges also matter. Because it's really interesting, actually a great case study to study Georgia at the moment, because actually politicians use the discourses used in the West by the liberal left to justify what they are doing, that actually Western knowledges are colonizing and we should get rid of all Western funding and all Western knowledge and we should embrace the local knowledges. So those discourses are taken very powerfully to actually perpetuate the disadvantage and change the political structure to have less freedoms for people, not more freedoms and more opportunities. So absolutely, I agree with you. We should never lose sight of these things. The purpose of the qualitative element of this study was to really understand the power of international education on individuals, you see, in terms of achieving more progressive change in society. And it was a purposive sample. It was not a random sample. Therefore, the story is focusing on the one aspect of this. However, the quantitative part that we have that looks at the flows, of course, there are limitations there as well, but that quantitative part is slightly more objective from a scientific perspective, I would say, and looks at those flows and correlations. And we have quite similar results about political change in quantitative part, which is yet unpublished. But I still believe, despite everything what's happening in the world, that there is some positive hope in international higher education.
All right.
Joonghyun, for your answers. Wide field.
What did you say?
Thank you for your answers.
Thank you for your
wide field for the future research.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Maya. I think you partly answered to our next question from Wang Jie. She asked about elaboration of interviewee selection. I think you already mentioned how you selected interviewees based on purposive sampling. If you want to add something, you can add more.
I can add, yes.
Yeah, sure.
Because
and then, and then next question from Jie, if your project also has some policy implication or policy recommendations for poverty reduction. That was a question from Jie. And Joanna, would you like to say your next question from Joanna? Yes.
Yes, my question is like, first of all, thank you for your wonderful sharing. Like, in the quantitative analysis, how did you control the confounding variables in influencing the reduction of poverty, such as like the country's intrinsic decline in poverty because of its economic development? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Joonghyun, do you want to take that last one and then I'll go to the question?
Yes. So thank you for the question. Yes, to control for the kind of another factors for reducing poverty. Actually, we included various of control variables, and also economic development. Yes, we included economic GDP per capita as control variables to control for account for those alternative explanations of the poverty reduction. Also, there is some another confounding things because of the poverty can also actually leads to some kind of outbound mobility rate. So countries with low poverty rate, it means the rich countries, actually in the rich country, there are many more outbound mobility, right? So it is like reverse correlations. We try to look at the impact of the student mobility on poverty, but maybe poverty might have impact on the international mobility. So we try to address those reverse causality or reverse correlation issues using the very advanced quantitative methods like generalized moments of methods. So that in the dynamic panel model, we also included the lag-dependent variable like 1 year lag of the poverty, right? So it controls for all other historically omitted other factors because it just controls for the 1 or 2 1 year's lag of the poverty. So actually it observes all others explanations about the poverty rate. So using the modeling strategy, we try to actually address this confounding and also these issues.
Okay, thank
Thank you,
you.
Joonghyun. Yeah. Maia?
Yes, thank you so much. And just very, very quick responses. I'm aware of time. So first one, we will very soon publish the big reports that we wrote for the funder in January. That will be published in 2 or 3 weeks, I hope, on our website. So that will describe everything in great detail, but largely in relation to the US mobility, okay, what the funder was interested in. But all the details about selection, etc., are there. So one thing to analyze is that for selection, we spent, I think, a slightly inefficient amount of time. We spent whole year putting together a database of potential interview participants. So researchers, we had one researcher for each region, one full-time postdoctoral researcher, which were reading the histories of each of the countries. So we had 70 countries across the world. So each researcher had 12 to 14 countries, and they were reading the histories of these countries in the last few decades and finding the key points in history and people who have contributed to those progressive changes. So we put together this huge Excel sheets with all this evidence and data. And then when we started interviewing, we realized that actually most of these people never responded to our interview invitations. So then we also did snowballing and additional methods of finding these people who contributed in different ways to their societies in the last few decades. So it was purposive sampling, but it was based on studying, on reading actually historical narratives, reading newspapers, media sources, different online publications, and figuring out who were the key people who made those contributions. So it was quite a thorough process, but extremely time consuming, I must say. And policy implications, we prepared some policy implications and policy recommendations for the US government, which are in the report, and you can read them in more detail when it's published. General policy implication would be to support international mobility, to offer scholarships to those who are in greatest need and who have the merit, obviously, and to offer those scholarships from host institutions and host countries, as well as from sending countries. Lots of middle-income countries nowadays and many high-income countries have scholarship schemes, and to sustain them and to at least sustain as they are now. But there are huge threats to those scholarship schemes at the moment across the world, including in the major recipient countries, as we know. And unfortunately, probably the situation will deteriorate. There will be less and less scholarship funding, I imagine, for students because of the insularity and nationalist sentiments in some of the key countries.
Well, thank you so much. We had one last question, but I think you already answered to that question, because Ellen's last question was about today's political tensions, how it will really affect this mobility. Somehow you already responded, and I'm aware of the time, so I will finish here today. Well, thank you so much for taking really long time to answer all those questions. If you want to speak some last comment, speakers?
No,
Do you have any final?
Thank you very much for inviting us.
To our research. Yep.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for all the participants and our two speakers. It was great discussion, and I'm looking forward to read all the final project report. If you don't mind, I will circulate all those reports to today's participants of the seminar. All right. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. And we have our next seminar scheduled next Monday. Let me just say it's next Monday, 4 p.m. We have a seminar about assessment in higher education. It's more teaching and learning aspects of higher education. So welcome to join next Monday seminar. Actually, it's hybrid. So you can join in person and you can also join in online. The details will be sent by emails. Well, thank you, everybody, and hope to see you in our next seminar. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Joonghyun, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for
yeah,
inviting me.
Maia left, and then all the best, and then keep in touch. All right.
Yep, I will contact you. Thank you.
예, 잘 가시고 또 연락드릴게요, 박사님. 건강하세요. 예, 잘, 바이바이.